They were told they were going to work, a new job, a better life. So they packed bags, held their children close, and boarded the trains, unaware they were heading straight into hell, crammed like cattle without food, water, or space to breathe. They traveled for hours, sometimes days, in darkness and silence. And when the doors finally opened, it wasn't a factory or a village. It was Auschwitz. What followed is almost too cruel to believe, but it happened. In March 1942, the first large group of Jewish women arrived in Auschwitz. They were from Slovakia, 997 of them, and most were between 16 and 35 years old. Many were students, shop workers, young wives. Auschwitz wasn't just a single camp. It was a complex of 3 main sections. Auschwitz I was the original camp where political prisoners were kept. Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau, was where mass murder took place. That's where most women were sent. Auschwitz III was used for forced labor. When the Slovak women arrived at Birkenau, there were barely any real buildings ready for them. The camp was still under construction, and instead of barracks, they were shoved into old horse stables filled with filth, lice, and the stench of waste. The guards treated them with brutal indifference from the moment they stepped off the train. Orders were barked in German, and those who didn't respond fast enough were beaten. Food was barely given out. Many went hungry the first night. Their names were replaced with tattooed numbers. Every step was meant to strip away their humanity. Every morning in Auschwitz began in complete darkness, often as early as 4 a.m. The sharp sound of whistles or barking dogs jolted women out of their sleep. There was no time to stretch, no time to think. They had to rush outside, often barefoot or with wooden clogs that were too small or broken. Snow, rain, mud, it didn't matter. Guards screamed at them to form rows for the morning roll call, called appel. They had to stand completely still, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours, even when the temperature dropped below freezing. If someone coughed too loudly, slumped from exhaustion, or even scratched an itch, they could be struck with a baton or rifle butt. If a woman collapsed and didn't get up fast enough, she was dragged away, sometimes never seen again. After roll call came forced labor. Most of it was hard physical work that destroyed their bodies. Women spent hours carrying huge stones from one end of the camp to the other without tools or machines. Others dug endless holes or loaded bricks for construction projects they didn't understand. Some were sent to the Canadian warehouses, where they sorted through the luggage stolen from incoming prisoners. They found dresses, pots, letters, and even wedding rings. Knowing those people had likely been killed within hours only made the job worse. Meals were barely enough to survive. A piece of stale bread, often moldy or chewed at by rats, and a bowl of watery soup made from turnips or cabbage stems. There was no breakfast, no real lunch. Sometimes the soup had worms. Women fought over crumbs or scraps on the floor. Hunger was constant. Some prisoners even dug through trash piles for rotten peels or bones. Starvation thinned their bodies so much that their skin clung to bones. Many fainted during work and were punished for being lazy. Sanitation didn't exist. The women slept packed into wooden bunks, 6 to 8 in a space meant for 2. There was no privacy, no rest. A single bucket served as a toilet for dozens of women, and it overflowed quickly. They weren't given soap or clean water. Their dresses, which were just thin striped uniforms, weren't washed for months. Lice bred fast in the filth, biting through their scalps and skin. Typhus spread constantly, killing many who were already weak from hunger. The stench of sweat, blood, and waste filled the air. Their heads were shaved on the first day, not for hygiene, but as a method of humiliation. Without hair, jewelry, or names, they became anonymous. Guards called them by numbers. Women didn't recognize each other after a few weeks. They looked alike, thin, pale, and broken. There were no weekends, no breaks, no mercy. But what came later would test them even more. In May 1943, the camp took on an even darker layer of horror when Dr. Josef Mengele arrived. Mengele was a medical doctor with a PhD in anthropology. He didn't use his knowledge to heal. He used it to torture. He was assigned to oversee selections on the ramp, but he spent much of his time conducting brutal medical experiments, especially on women. His fascination with genetics led him to focus on female twins. As soon as the twins stepped off the trains, Mengele personally selected them. Many were young girls, often under the age of 10. They were told they'd be treated better, that they were special. But what followed was months of agony. Inside his laboratory, Mengele performed countless procedures. He injected methylene blue and other chemicals into their eyes, hoping to create artificial blue irises. He sewed the veins of two twins together to try and create conjoined twins. If one twin died during an experiment, the other was killed immediately for comparison. Autopsies were then performed with detailed notes. Mengele showed no emotion, often whistling classical music while conducting these tests. The children were starved and exposed to diseases. He measured everything, their bones, heads, and blood types, trying to connect genetics to race. But Mengele's cruelty didn't end with twins. He also focused on adult female prisoners, especially pregnant women. If he suspected a woman was pregnant, she was often taken to his lab. There, without anesthesia or sterilized tools, he sliced open their abdomens to study fetal development. The women were not treated afterward. Most bled to death. Those who survived the procedures were either gassed or executed by gunshot. Sterilization was another obsession. Mengele and other Nazi doctors injected women with caustic substances into their wombs or exposed their ovaries to radiation. The goal was to stop them from ever having children. These experiments caused severe internal damage, including ruptured organs, infections, and chronic pain. No consent was given. These women were test subjects, nothing more. Hungarian Jewish doctor Gisela Perl, who was imprisoned at Auschwitz, later explained the unbearable choices she faced. Mengele sometimes tasked her with identifying pregnant women, but instead she performed secret abortions in filthy conditions to save them from being executed. She used no tools, no anesthesia, only her hands and desperate courage. If Mengele discovered her actions, she would have been killed. But she kept doing it because the alternative was worse. Now, not all cruelty in Auschwitz came from male officers. Female guards, known as Aufseherinnen, were deeply involved in the daily abuse and destruction of women's lives inside the camp. Over 200 of these women served in Auschwitz between 1942 and 1945. They weren't simply assistants or background figures. They had authority. They gave orders. And many of them were just as brutal, if not more, than the men. One of the most notorious was Irma Greza. She arrived at Auschwitz in 1943, barely 19 years old. Before joining the SS, she had worked on a farm and later at a hospital. But inside Auschwitz, she quickly became feared. She dressed neatly, often wore makeup, and sprayed herself with perfume, details that made her cruelty even more disturbing. Greza carried a whip, a pistol, and sometimes a trained dog. She beat women for tiny reasons, standing crooked during roll call, speaking without permission, or simply being too slow to respond. Prisoners reported that she laughed during beatings. Some women were kicked in the stomach so violently that they died within days. Maria Mandel was the head of all female guards in Auschwitz. As the Lagerführerin, or camp leader, she held a high-ranking position. Her word carried weight. She supervised roll calls, organized selections, and managed the women's camp with an iron grip. Mandel was directly involved in deciding which prisoners were fit for labor and which would be sent to the gas chambers. She kept detailed lists and sometimes personally pointed out women she wanted removed. She also helped create the camp's women's orchestra, forcing prisoners to play music during roll calls and selections, adding a twisted layer of mockery to the suffering. There were others, too. Johanna Bormann and Elisabeth Wolkenrath were both SS guards in Auschwitz and later transferred to other camps. They were known for kicking prisoners, locking them in punishment cells without food or water, and using attack dogs to scare and injure women. Many of these guards were not trained professionals. Some had been hairdressers, factory workers, or secretaries before the war. But once they put on the uniform, many embraced the power and violence the system gave them. The brutality came from all directions. Being a mother or even showing signs of pregnancy meant immediate danger. The Nazi system didn't allow for children in the camp. Rudolf Höss, the commandant, had a clear policy that children were unfit for labor, and therefore useless. When trains arrived, SS officers separated mothers with children from the rest of the group. Many women, thinking their children might be spared, pleaded to be sent elsewhere or allowed to work. But these decisions had already been made. Mothers were sent directly to the gas chambers, often within hours of arriving. Pregnant women faced an even more horrifying fate. If a woman was visibly pregnant upon arrival, she was typically sent to death with no questions asked. The Nazis didn't want children being born inside the camp. Even when pregnancies were discovered later, the outcome was almost always the same. Some women tried to hide it by binding their stomachs with rags, avoiding eye contact during roll calls, or staying near the back of the line. They skipped meals or stood hunched to avoid suspicion. But guards were always watching. Once discovered, these women were either subjected to cruel experiments by camp doctors or taken away and executed. Despite the odds, a few women made it far enough into their pregnancies to give birth. These deliveries were done in filthy conditions, with no medical supplies, no clean linens, and often no trained help. Sometimes another prisoner with basic knowledge, like a nurse or a midwife, assisted, but the reality was bleak. The newborns were often killed immediately, drowned in buckets, or smothered. In some cases, mothers were forced to watch their babies die before being sent to their own deaths. The few infants who lived longer were hidden by other prisoners, but they rarely survived more than a few days due to starvation, infection, or exposure. By December 1944, only 3 babies born in Auschwitz were known to have survived among thousands of pregnancies. The rest were lost, either never born or killed shortly after birth. Some women made impossible choices, like giving up their babies in hopes that another prisoner might keep them safe. Others attempted to miscarry through starvation or physical strain to avoid the wrath of the guards. And what awaited them in the gas chambers was just as horrifying. The gas chambers at Auschwitz were designed to kill on an industrial scale, quickly and without resistance. Most female prisoners who arrived by train never made it into the camp itself. They were selected right on the ramp and sent directly to these killing rooms. The process was chillingly organized. SS guards calmly told women they were going for disinfection, especially after long, filthy train journeys. Mothers with children were reassured. Older women were promised rest. They were handed towels, bars of soap, and sometimes told to remember the number of their hooks so they could collect their belongings after the shower. Inside the chambers, the doors were sealed shut. The rooms were packed tightly, often with hundreds of women at a time. No one knew what was coming until it was too late. Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, was dropped in from vents in the ceiling or sidewalls. Within minutes, the gas began to choke the air. Panic spread fast. Women screamed, pushed, and climbed over each other, trying to reach the doors. Some tried to shield their children. Others clawed at the walls with their nails. The gas attacked the lungs and the brain, causing dizziness, paralysis, and then death, usually within 10 to 15 minutes. Once the room fell silent, a special group of prisoners, called Sonderkommando, was forced to go in and remove the bodies. The floor was often littered with twisted limbs, contorted faces, and piles of corpses tangled together. It was their job to separate them, shave off the remaining hair, remove earrings, and pry gold fillings from their teeth. The bodies were then loaded into carts and taken to the crematoriums, where they were burned day and night. The smoke rose constantly above Birkenau, filling the sky with the stench of death. The hair taken from women was cleaned, packed, and sent to factories in Germany. It was used to make mattress stuffing, fabric, and even socks for U-boat crews. The Nazis used every part of their victims, turning death into an economy. Women's jewelry, clothing, and even shoes were sorted and reused. Nothing was left untouched. By the summer of 1944, especially during the mass deportations from Hungary, up to 6,000 people were gassed each day in Auschwitz. The majority were women and children. Entire families vanished in hours. Trains arrived, emptied, and within a few hours, those people were smoke in the air and ash in a pit. But for many, death was decided even earlier, selected with a simple gesture. At the arrival ramp, SS doctors like Josef Mengele stood with a casual, almost bored expression as hundreds of prisoners stepped down from the train cars. One glance, one flick of the wrist decided your fate. A point to the left meant immediate death in the gas chambers. A point to the right meant temporary survival in forced labor. The decision took seconds. Old women, women with even slight limps, women clinging to small children. Most of them were waved to the left without a word. No explanations, no appeals. Inside the camp, selections continued. Every few weeks, all the women were ordered to strip naked and line up. They stood in the cold or heat, exposed and humiliated. Guards and SS doctors walked slowly down the line, inspecting bodies for signs of weakness. Ribs showing too much, wounds that weren't healing, swollen feet. Any of these could get a woman marked. Sometimes a pencil line was drawn on their chest. Other times their number was recorded. Once you were marked, there was nothing more to do but wait. The next morning, those selected were taken away. Many thought they were being transferred to another work site. Instead, they were led to the gas chambers. Some women tried everything they could to avoid selection. They slapped their cheeks to look less pale. They rubbed ashes or mud on their faces to look healthier. Others pinched their skin or tied cloth around their limbs to make themselves seem stronger. Prisoners helped each other by giving advice, standing tall, not limp, and avoiding eye contact. But it often didn't matter. The guards had already decided who lived and who died. In the infirmary barracks, known as the Krankenbau, women who were sick or injured were particularly vulnerable. Even if they were recovering, they were often selected just for being there. Doctors in the camp sometimes gave fake diagnosis to try to protect certain women. But discovery meant punishment or death for them too. The mental toll of these selections was enormous. Women lived in constant fear. They couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't rest, because at any moment they might be called again. There was no safety, no pattern to predict. Survival became a matter of chance, not strength. But even in a place built to crush every last bit of hope, some women risked everything to fight back. In October 1944, 4 young Jewish women, Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Estusia Weisblum, and Regina Safirstein, became part of one of the most daring acts of resistance inside Auschwitz. They worked in the Union munitions factory under constant watch, surrounded by guards. But little by little, they managed to smuggle tiny amounts of gunpowder out of the factory in scraps of clothing, hidden in their pockets or underneath their fingernails. That gunpowder was passed to the Sonderkommando, a group of male Jewish prisoners, forced to work in the crematoria. On October 7, 1944, using what the women had given them, the Sonderkommando blew up Crematorium 4. The explosion damaged the gas chamber beyond repair and sparked a brief revolt, though it was quickly crushed, and many were killed. The message was sent that even here, people were willing to fight. The SS launched an investigation and eventually discovered who had supplied the explosives. The 4 women were arrested, brutally tortured, and publicly executed by hanging on January 6th. 1945, just weeks before the camp was liberated. On January 27, 1945, when Soviet troops entered Auschwitz, they found around 7,000 survivors. Most were sick, starving, and barely alive. Among them were about 500 children and many women. The Nazis had tried to destroy the evidence, burnt documents, blown up buildings, but they couldn't hide the truth. Piles of corpses, rooms filled with human hair, mountains of shoes. For most women, liberation came too late. Of the estimated 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz, around 200,000 were women. Less than 10% survived. Those who did survive carried the pain with them forever. Scars on their bodies, nightmares in their heads. Many never spoke about it again. But some told their stories, so the world would never forget. After the war, some of the female guards were tried and executed. Irma Greza was hanged in December 1945. Maria Mandel, too. But many escaped justice. Josef Mengele ran to South America. He died in Brazil in 1979, never punished. Rudolf Hess, the camp commandant, was hanged in 1947 in Auschwitz, near the gas chamber. The truth is, no punishment could ever match the pain they caused. And for many of the women who suffered there, justice never came.